So it's been 4 months, something like that. Anyways, on my work surface, I have some duct tape laid down, adhesive side up. Were I to do this over again, I would certainly use painter's tape. This duct tape proves to be challenging, is a word I would use to describe this process. Now I'm mixing up some plaster of Paris, a fairly thin set. I want to be able to pour this stuff more like a melted milkshake as opposed to peanut butter, consistency wise. Pouring this out to about 1/8 of an inch thickness. Gonna spread it some, kind of work out some of those air bubbles. After this plaster starts to set up a little bit, I'm coming in with a tongue depressor and creating some texture. There's a few different tools for this, but tongue depressor is the first step. Then I move on to a dental or O-ring pick, laying in some heavier striation here. You can also use a wire brush. Trying to keep this pretty random. And these are the bases that I have set out to use. These bases are various sizes so that I can cast various base sizes. And to add some height variation, I am using crumpled up brown paper, basically packing paper, I guess. You could use, just about anything here. Cardboard would work well. This is what I'm going with because I got a ton of it. Just hot gluing some of this down in some places. After that, I am taking tacky glue and coming in with some of the plaster that I've broken away. From that duct tape. Again, I really think that duct tape was a mistake. If I were to do this over again, probably go with painter's tape or just a sheet of plastic. Maybe even some aluminum foil. I'm trying to create some interesting rock texture here. Breaking up some of the smaller pieces to fill in some of the gaps. And that's pretty much a finished base. I'm going to come in with some gravel. Fill in some of those larger gaps with that. I've got about 10 bases finished here. Ready for paint. It's actually primer in this case, but it's still paint. Just kind of sealing in that plaster. I'm going to cast these in silicone, so I do not want that silicone absorbing into the plaster of Paris. That would make things difficult to remove later. here the paint has dried and everything is ready to go. I've got to cut some strips for flashing to keep the silicone in place. I'm just using a aluminum piece of angle as my straight edge. These pieces of cardboard, or cardstock actually, are, I'd say, 1.5 inches tall. Certainly tall enough that I do not have to worry about the silicone spilling over. Just cut a ton of these. Kind of have these folded to size. I'm going to show you how I glue them down. Go ahead and glue these two pieces together, one strip. I've measured everything, so I know I've got the right shape I want. I know I've got the folds in the right places. Really important here to make sure you've got a solid bead of glue so you do not have to worry about silicone seeping through. And this is a 10 cure silicone. It's a 10-to-1 ratio. Silicone to hardener, or silicone to hardener, however you want to pronounce that. This was the bottom of my kit, so I just went ahead and poured the rest of the catalyst in. And I am mixing. Using a drill bit here, I'm introducing a ton of air, so I'm going to put this in a vacuum chamber. Get as much of that air out as possible. Just fit the whole bucket in there, because why not? This is a pretty small vacuum chamber, but honestly I don't need a big one, so I didn't buy a big one. Away she goes. You can see the air boiling out of this. And yeah, pretty nice. I hold vacuum on this for about 15 minutes. Probably didn't need to, but I found some other stuff to do in the meantime. And I am slowly releasing vacuum. Apparently if you do it too quickly, you're going to have some sort of, not explosion, but your lid can pop off and scare the hell out of you, I guess. I'm not sure. It's not something I plan on finding out. But yeah, vacuum chamber. Pretty handy tool to have. If you do not have one, I would recommend just mixing this by hand. It's going to take you a long time, but you will not introduce nearly as much air. I would also recommend doing a high pour on your silicone, keeping a very thin stream so that you pop those air bubbles as you pour it. And honestly, if you're not going to use a vacuum chamber, probably use a platinum cure silicone as opposed to a 10 cure. Platinum cure is a bit more pricey, but it's much easier to work with. Now I have given that silicone time to cure. I'm demolding everything. You're probably going to end up with the stuck bits of plaster like I have here. Be willing to sacrifice a little bit of resin for your first pour, just to get all those little bits of silicone and paint out of your mold before you do your first true pour. Understand you're going to have some debris in here, basically. So yeah, I'm going with a 2-part urethane resin. Honestly, just to clean my mold out. This resin has a 24-hour cure time. That's going to vary based on temperature. Also, I am mixing up 2 different batches here because I'm using 2 different inks or 2 different colors. I'm trying to end up with a lava magma type base, also a ice or frozen base. I've put way too much pigment in here. This batch comes out sort of almost opaque. Also, I'm mixing into the A part of this resin. No real rhyme or reason for that. That's what I chose to do. You're only going to want to add a couple of drops of acrylic ink if you are going for a semi-transparent look. Again, like I said, I added way too much ink here. If you're going for a more opaque look, you can add this much ink, or you can just go with a actual acrylic paint. For epoxy resins, it does not inhibit the curing process. Going with a high pour here, trying to keep as many air bubbles out as possible. I'm going to come back with a heat gun after this starts to settle and use that to pop some of those surface air bubbles. I was really unhappy with the way the color turned out on this particular batch, but this is the only batch I filmed. This is my second go of it. As you can see, things are a bit lighter like I said, you only want to use a few drops of that ink. You do not want to pour nearly as much as I did. This epoxy resin releases really nicely from these molds also. And I'm sure you can imagine what these pieces would have looked like had I not done that first pour to get all the remaining debris out of these molds. I would have had a lot of work to do. There'd be a lot of pieces missing, and it just would have been pretty much a waste. It isn't so much the fact that the urethane resin is cheaper than the epoxy resin that I'm using here. It's more of a time issue. The urethane resin dries in 20 minutes. This epoxy resin, which I've dyed, dries in 24 hours. So I wanted to be able to pull these pretty quickly. Now on to the painting process. Pretty simple for the frost or ice bases. Basically just a dry brush, a white dry brush. Nothing too crazy. I go with a few layers, start out pretty light and then get slightly darker. I'm also going to go around the edge of this and paint it black. You don't have to, but I think it makes things look a bit cleaner. And obviously you could go with, whatever color you want. I just chose black. I'm just painting over this with a acrylic craft paint. No primer, obviously. Though I suppose you could go with a clear adhesion promoter. I haven't really found that necessary. This paint tends to adhere pretty well by itself. And again, just quickly going around this edge with a black. This is model paint. Pretty quick little detail here that doesn't take much time but adds to the finished product, I think. And I'm starting on the lava bases. This is a very different process from the frost base. I'm going really heavy first with my lightest color, my orange. Pretty much hitting every surface that is not a deep recess, then adding a little red, going slightly darker. You could dry brush everything. I'm just, going with a slight wet blend. Adding a little brown in less of the area. Adding some richness to the base. I'm going to realize at some point here that the colors are blending too well. I'm gonna let this dry a bit after I add some of this black, and then I will come in a little later after this is dried and go with a darker dry brush. But yeah, this ends up being a pretty nice effect with the transparent resin I went with. That paint's had some time to dry. Coming in with the brown, and I'm wet blending in a little bit of black. Getting much better coverage now that the orange and red have dried. Kind of starting to look like something. This is a very easy way to attain this look. Also have some depth added. Just by the material you cast in. And again here I'm going to clean up this rim on the base. And yeah, I kind of treat my brushes like crap. At least my terrain brushes. I've got some nicer brushes for my models that I try to treat a little better. And again, this that base rim paint was done in real time, or just about. It took no time at all. This is what you got. Pretty quick.